March 1942. The Japanese war machine was rolling south across the Pacific, and the British Solomon Islands Protectorate lay directly in its path. At the government station on Eola Bay, Guadalcanal, a 26-year-old colonial officer named Martin Clemens found himself face to face with a circle of frightened village headmen. They had heard that every European on the island was fleeing, that the district officer had already gone, and that the Japanese would be upon them within weeks. They wanted to know one thing. Would he stay, or would he abandon them like the rest? Clemens looked at their anxious faces and gave them a promise he had no real authority to make. He told them he would remain no matter what happened, and that someday, somehow, help would come. It was a desperate pledge, and Clemens knew it. The British government had given him no troops, no weapons beyond a handful of police rifles, and no plan for defense. All he had was a worn-out teleradio set, a device originally designed for Australia's Flying Doctor Service, which he would use to report enemy movements to a distant naval intelligence station. The teleradio was an all-metal box with separate transmitter and receiver units, powered by heavy 6-volt batteries that had to be charged with a temperamental petrol engine. It was his only lifeline to the outside world, and keeping it working would become an obsession in the months ahead. With that fragile promise and that fragile machine, Martin Clemens began the lonely work of building an intelligence network from scratch on an island about to be swallowed by war. By mid-March, Clemens knew the Japanese would not wait forever. He sailed his little schooner along the coast to the remote western plantation of Lavoro, where an old-timer named Snowy Rhodes had volunteered to stay behind and watch the sea approaches. Rhodes was a quiet, determined Australian with a pipe clamped between his teeth and a wicked gleam in his eye. Clemens installed a second teleradio in Rhodes's hilltop house, stringing the aerial between two coconut palms, and showed him how to operate the set. Then he gave him a formal appointment as a member of the British Solomon Islands Protectorate Defense Force, a scrap of paper that would mean nothing if the Japanese ever caught him, but it was all the authority Clemens could offer. From Lavoro, Clemens pushed eastward, carrying out a harsh scorched earth policy on every abandoned plantation and mission station he passed. He pulled the flue pipes out of copper dryers, removed the distributor heads from trucks, and smashed any machinery that might serve the enemy. At the Catholic mission of Vizale, Bishop Jean-Marie Aubin insisted on staying neutral and refused to evacuate, a position Clemens respected but privately considered suicidal. At Maravovo, the Anglican mission, he warned the priests to hide their food stores and printing press before the Japanese arrived. By the time Clemens returned to Eola in early April, he had disabled a dozen installations and left a trail of ruined equipment behind him. There was nothing left on the northern coast that could help the Japanese except the loyalty of the islanders themselves. That loyalty was tested sooner than anyone expected. In mid-April, a messenger arrived at Eola with a note from the goldfields. A European prospector named Billy Wilmot had been found dead in his shack, and F.M. Campbell, a former police officer, suspected murder. The initial report suggested suicide. A revolver lay on the table beside him, and the local people assumed he had blown his brains out. But Clemens, who had some training in police work, was not satisfied. He hiked up into the hills with a small party of scouts and dug up the body himself. The post-mortem was brutal but revealing. There were no powder burns, no bullet holes, and no signs of a self-inflicted wound. What Clemens found instead was a clean, deep cut across the skull, made by two powerful swings of a sharp axe. The murder of a European in the Solomons was never a simple matter, but in the middle of a war it carried an extra weight of danger. If the islanders believed that law and order had collapsed, there would be nothing to stop a wave of killings. Clemens spent a full day cross-examining every man who had passed near Wilmot's shack on Good Friday, the day of the murder. He found one suspect whose alibi did not hold together, a local man who owned an axe of exactly the right size and who had been seen near the scene at the critical hour. There was no way to prove the case beyond a doubt, so Clemens detained the man and sent him down to the coast for further questioning. The investigation would have to wait. The Japanese were coming, and Martin Clemens still had to keep his promise. On the morning of May 4th, 1942, the stillness over Eola Bay shattered. From his lookout post, Martin Clemens saw what he had prayed for: American carrier planes diving out of the clouds onto Tulagi Harbor, where the Japanese fleet had anchored only the day before. Wave after wave of dive bombers rolled in, and Clemens watched through binoculars as enemy ships erupted in flames. The raid lasted most of the day, and by nightfall 14 Japanese vessels had been sunk or limped away, and a pall of black smoke hung over the anchorage. The elation on the beach was short-lived. 2 days later, a local runner brought word that an American torpedo bomber had ditched off the south coast. The crew had drifted for 3 days before being rescued by a Catholic missionary, Brother James Thrift, who brought them to Aola aboard the schooner Ramada. The pilot and his radio men had taken part in the attack on Tulagi on the 4th, then run out of fuel on the long flight back to their carrier. Over breakfast of steak and eggs from Clemens's dwindling stores, Ewalt gave a detailed account of the raid. He described direct hits on a Japanese transport and a destroyer off Savo Island. Clemens in turn explained his coast-watching network, which had tracked every enemy ship movement into the harbor. The two Americans were eager to get back to Pearl Harbor, but they agreed to stay a few days until a southbound schooner could take them. They departed for the New Hebrides a week later, carried south by the schooner G.F. Jones. Clemens knew their departure would leave him even more alone. A Royal Australian Air Force, RAAF Catalina, flying boat, damaged beyond repair by enemy bombing on the 1st of May, sat beached on the sand, a perfect target marker for the patrolling Kawanisi flying boats. Clemens knew he could not let it fall into enemy hands. He gathered 400 men from the surrounding villages and, working against the next morning's patrol schedule, slid the massive plane across the beach on coconut fronds. At dusk on May 7th, Clemens gave the order to burn. The men surrounded the Catalina with firewood, poured on the fuel, and set it alight. The flames rose high against the darkening sky, consuming the fabric and aluminum skin. For 90 minutes, the aircraft burned, and Clemens held his breath, waiting for the drone of enemy engines. None came. The fire died, leaving a skeleton of twisted wing spars and the two heavy engines half buried in the sand. In the weeks that followed, Clemens evacuated his headquarters inland to a bush village called Paripao, 8 miles into the jungle and 1,000 feet up. In the damp mountain camp, Clemens set up his teleradio and kept the schedule. Every morning he heard the Kawanasis take off from Tulagi and begin their patrols. The Japanese were settling in, and the intelligence flow was critical. On the 10th of May, a scout arrived with troubling news from Nagila Island. A native medical practitioner who had turned collaborator was seen in Tulagi, walking freely among the Japanese, translating for them and pointing out former government officers and their habits. The betrayal hit hard. Bogesi knew the islanders, knew the bush tracks, knew the names and faces of every European who had stayed behind. If the Japanese decided to use him as a guide, Clemens's carefully built hideouts and communication lines could be compromised. He sent word to every village along the coast. If Bogesi set foot on Guadalcanal, he was to be detained by force. But the damage was done. The Japanese had a willing collaborator who could give them everything they needed to hunt the Coastwatchers down. From Paripao, Clemens looked north across the channel. The Tulagi anchorage was now a Japanese base. The burning of the Catalina on the beach felt like the closing of a door. He could no longer live openly on the coast. The only way to survive was to remain in the shadows, invisible and silent, and keep sending his reports into the air. The network of scouts and village watchers still functioned, but every signal carried the risk of direction-finding equipment that could lead the enemy straight to his camp. He told his sergeant to reduce the number of people coming up the trail and told his clerk to encode every message faster. The Japanese occupation had begun, and there would be no relief for many months. By late May, the Japanese were settling into Guadalcanal in force. Landing parties came ashore almost daily at Lunga, Kukum, and Tanaru, and their destroyers patrolled the coast as if it were already theirs. From his hideout at Paripao, Clemens watched the enemy trucks moving on the plains and heard the din of construction work behind the coconut palms. He knew he needed eyes closer to the enemy, men who could move among the villages without arousing suspicion. The native police were loyal, but they were known faces. He needed someone the Japanese had never seen. In early May, a sturdy, barrel-chested man in his 40s reported for duty at Paripao. Jacob Vuza was a retired police sergeant major, a Guadalcanal man who had served 25 years on Malaita and knew the islanders and their ways. Clemens had been unsure how to use him, but the moment had arrived. He sent Vuza to the Coley Point area, the coastal region east of the Lunga Plain, with orders to organize a village watching network and report every Japanese movement. Vuza nodded, picked up his rifle, and walked down the trail toward the coast without another word. On the morning of July 5th, he packed the Teleradio onto the shoulders of his carriers and struck deeper into the mountains. The trail climbed steeply through dripping jungle, then crossed a knife-edged saddle of rock with a sheer drop on both sides. At the end of that razorback sat the village of Vungana, a cluster of a dozen huts perched on a pinnacle of stone, 3,000 feet above the sea. The view from Vungana was worth every step of the climb. To the north, Clemens could see the full expanse of Tulagi Harbor, the channel to Savo Island, and the entire northern coastline of Guadalcanal from Cape Esperance to beyond Coley Point. The Japanese anchorage at Lunga lay spread below him like a map. He rigged the Teleradio aerial between two beetle nut palms and began sending daily reports on every ship that entered the channel, every landing craft that beached on the shore, every dump of supplies that grew on the plain. The information went out in short bursts to avoid Japanese direction finding, then was relayed to Australia. By mid-July, the charging engine that kept the Teleradio alive began to fail. It coughed, stalled, and refused to start no matter how many times Clemens cranked it. Without it, the batteries would die, and with them his only voice to the outside world. There were no spares to be had anywhere on the island, except for an old motor Clemens remembered at Barande Plantation, now occupied by a Japanese labor camp. One of the scouts, a wiry, unsmiling man named Gumu, stepped forward and said he would get it. Gumu walked down to Barande and presented himself as a laborer looking for work. The Japanese put him to work in the camp, and for several days he carried loads, cleaned gear, and served as a batman to a Japanese officer. All the while, he kept his eyes on the shed where the old charging motor lay. On the night he chose to move, Gumu slipped out of the laborer's hut, lifted the motor from its mount, and carried it through the darkness to the edge of the camp. He walked all night, and by dawn he was well into the hills. When he set the motor down at Vungana, Clemens bolted it into place, cranked it once, and heard it fire. The Teleradio came back to life. By the third week of July 1942, the Japanese patrols were pressing closer to Clemens's mountain hideout at Vungana. He decided on one more move, farther into the inaccessible interior. The scouts led him to a place called Vuchikoro, a naked pinnacle of volcanic rock that rose above a wild gorge. To reach it, the men had to haul the Teleradio and batteries up a cliff face with ropes, the river roaring far below. The village consisted of 4 filthy huts, and the few inhabitants were numbed into silence by the perpetual cold and damp. The position was untenable. Food could not reach Vuchikoro, and the scouts returned from foraging with barely enough roots to keep a man alive. After only 5 days, Clemens admitted defeat and ordered the party back down the gorge to the village of Matanga. The return journey was brutal. He had no shoes left. His feet were bruised and bleeding from the rocks, and a fever had settled into his bones. When the carriers brought in the last of the gear, they reported that every cache of food on the coast had been found and looted by the Japanese. After returning to Matanga, Clemens climbed back to the ridge at Vungana to maintain his watch over the coast. Then, on the morning of August 7th, 1942, the roar of naval gunfire and the deep hum of approaching aircraft shattered the silence over the jungle. From his hidden post in the hills, Clemens watched the horizon fill with ships and planes. The United States 1st Marine Division was landing on the beaches of Guadalcanal. The promise he had made to the headmen 5 months earlier was finally being fulfilled. He remained in the jungle, maintaining his watch and relaying observations to the Marines through his scouts. It was not until August 15th that Clemens finally gathered his men and walked down the mountain to make direct contact with the American lines. The relief of Guadalcanal did not come easily. In the months that followed, Clemens and his scouts fought alongside the Marines, providing intelligence, guiding patrols, and ambushing Japanese positions. Jacob Vuza was captured by the Japanese but survived torture to deliver vital intelligence. He later received the British Empire Medal and was knighted by the Queen. Clemens's key aides, Sergeant Andrew Langabea and senior clerk Daniel Puel, each contributed to the survival of the network. Andrew Langabea earned the British Empire Medal for his steadfast loyalty. Daniel Puel organized the flow of intelligence from the villages and was later recognized with the British Empire Medal for his service. Snowy Roadies was evacuated and later received the Distinguished Service Cross, but none of them forgot the lonely weeks before the Marines came, when the only thing that kept them going was a promise made in a circle of frightened headmen on a forgotten island.